then 5 minutes, another one will start.
God says he's not the author of confusion.
Yeah.
Where was this?
What's that?
Where was this?
This is the second station. Okay, we're by the first and second stations of the Via Dolorosa. And so it's going to end very soon.
Do you know what those branches are right there?
No. It's a plant.
Right over here, people live
Yeah, these are different types of wall plants. Okay, let's all gather around here. And so we're now standing on the grounds of the Antonia Fortress. Remember the fortress we saw? Okay. The fortress was an atrium, which means it was a closed courtyard surrounded by a wall and towers on every side. And we're now standing over the foundations of that fortress, all right? And so the walls and the towers are long gone. They were destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD, but sometimes you can see fragments of the original floor, which would have been here. This is the place where tradition puts Pontius Pilate that night, okay? Remember, Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of the province of Judea, and he resided in Caesarea by the sea. But, you know, part of his job description was to come over to Jerusalem every now and then, and especially during the great festivals, okay? The city had attracted, obviously, hundreds of thousands of Jews. Tensions were about to reach boiling point, and the Romans knew that, and therefore he had to see by himself, it was his responsibility to see to that nothing, okay, no threat was to be made against Roman interests in this region. This is why tradition puts Pontius Pilate that night in the Praetorium. The Praetorium is essentially the army barracks, okay? This is where the Roman force that was stationed in Jerusalem was at. And you remember that very late, early in the morning, right? Jesus had already been through a series of trials before the leadership of the Jews. And then finally, he is sent over to the most senior Roman official in the city that night, which was Pontius Pilate. Now, let me ask you a question. Why didn't the Jews execute Jesus? After all, it was their conspiracy.
killed, right?
What? Why didn't the high priest sentence Jesus to death? Because he couldn't. Okay, by that time, it was only the Romans who could pass capital punishment for political reasons. I mean, the high priest did have some authority when it came to the Jewish law, but remember that the accusation that was made against Jesus was political in nature. What did the leaders of the Jews say? That he was calling himself, what?
King of the Jews.
Son of God and the King of the Jews. I mean, the Romans couldn't care less about Son of God part, okay? The King of the Jews. This is a political statement, right? And as such, right, he was seen as a threat to Roman interests. Now, we know that Pilate was a very brutal and ruthless ruler. We know that for a fact. All of those governors were horrible, okay? But he was no fool. And he could see right away that there was nothing, okay? There was just a conspiracy, a Jewish conspiracy. And you remember that he is very reluctant to sentence Jesus to death. He even sends Jesus over to Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, who was also a guest here in the city. Antipas sends him back. Essentially, he says, it's your problem, Pilate, right? Deal with it. And when Pilate realizes that he's pushed to the corner, remember what was the threat that was made against him by the leaders of the Jews? Unless you do that, we will call you no friend of Caesar. In other words, okay, you're not taking care of Roman interests in this region. Well, that was too much for him. And that's why he decides to wash his hands. And essentially what he's saying is, have it your way, okay? I'm not going to put my neck down for this, low-life Galilean. He could care less, really. And he washes his hands, okay, and sends him over, but not before he will scourge him, okay? Now take a look at the ornament over the door there, okay? You see the motif there, which is the crown of thorns, okay, that were placed on Jesus' head. By the way, this little chapel was designed by Antonio Berlucci, the same architect who designed Gethsemane and the Mount of Beatitudes. And this church here is the second station to remember the flagellation, or rather the scourging of Jesus by Pilate. So before Jesus is sent on his way to be crucified, he's beaten up, okay, real bad. Now let me just tell you a little something about flagellation and scourging. Flagellation was an old Jewish punishment. Okay, in fact, it was 39 lashes on the back. The punishment, in fact, the biblical one was 40 lashes, but since they didn't want to go over the 40th, they only applied 39. Okay, they knew that be above that number, the person was most likely to die. The Romans could care less. Okay, for them, it was just a matter of to see how far they could prolong, his life. And in fact, the Romans would even call scourging near death or half death. And that was their little game. They would strip the victim down and then would tie his hands to a pole, and they would beat him up. How many of you have seen the Passion of Christ, Mel Gibson's?
Yeah,
okay. All right, so you probably remember what it was like. The whip that was used by the Roman soldiers was a special one. Unlike the Jewish whip, which was just a bull's whip, leather, the Roman whip had sharp objects attached to the edges, okay? Sometimes even fish hooks. Just try to imagine the impact of something like that on one's back. Eusebius, one of the fathers of the early church, described scourging as near-death experience. He even went into all the graphic details, describing how after several lashes on the back, entire chunks of tissue and skin would be removed. After a few more times, flesh would be, taken off. And then after more lashes, okay, you could sometimes even see right through the rib case into the internal organs, okay? Most people did not survive that. In fact, that was, in a sense, a kind of a death penalty, right? Just try to imagine that Jesus endured that before he even made the first step along the Via Dolorosa. No wonder he could not carry the traverse beam. It was very heavy. And of course, that coincides with the prophecy in Isaiah 53, okay, that speaks about how the Messiah, by his stripes, will bear the iniquities of the world, okay? So Jesus basically took the fall for us. We were supposed to receive that punishment, but Jesus did that for us. And so this is, I think, a very, very important opportunity. And again, there are all these distractions, the shops and the sound of the call for prayer and everything else. But I really think that as Christians, we earlier celebrated the victory of Christ, but let's remember that he came at a very high price, okay? And he paid that ultimate price. So that is the Via Dolorosa. Before we continue, if you want to go real quick to the interior part of the chapel to take some pictures, there's a beautiful stained window.